The Imperium teaches that faith is humanity's shield against the darkness. It trains its citizens to report heresy, to distrust the alien and the mutant, to recite their prayers with perfect precision. Every hive world has a cathedral. Every factory district has a shrine. Trillions of souls repeat the same litanies every day, confident that their devotion protects them from corruption. But what happens when that faith becomes the weapon turned against them? The word bearers. Legion understands something the Imperium refuses to acknowledge. Belief is not armor. Belief is a door. And if you know where to knock, if you whisper the right words through the right cracks, that door opens from the inside. By the time the planetary defense forces realize they're under attack, the war for their souls is already over. My name is Administratum Clerk Tertius Valen, assigned to census operations on Eurida Prime. I survived long enough to understand how they did it, how the word bearers took a loyal Imperial world and convinced it to destroy itself without firing a shot, how they turned our faith into chains, our prayers into invitations, and our certainty into blindness. This is not a story about conquest. It's a record of conversion. Eurida Prime classified itself as stable. Population 7 billion, distributed across 3 primary hive cities and 17 secondary settlements. Tithe compliance rated at 93% over the preceding century. Planetary Defense Force maintained at regulation strength. Ecclesiarchy presence documented across all major population centers, with cathedral complexes in each hive capital. The world produced agricultural supplements for the sector, processed through industrial facilities in the lower hive levels. Citizens worked their shifts, attended their mandatory devotions, and raised their children to do the same. Imperial Guard regiments recruited from our population regularly, taking the best and strongest to serve the Emperor across the stars. We were proud of that contribution. I worked in Hive Primus, specifically in the Census Bureau's Verification Division. My job involved cross-referencing birth records against tithe documentation, ensuring no citizens disappeared from the registers without explanation. Tedious work, necessary work, the kind of bureaucratic function that keeps a hive world operating properly. The first irregularity appeared in my reports 17 months before the invasion. Nothing dramatic, a slight statistical deviation in underhive birth registrations. The numbers suggested a population increase in sectors that should have been declining due to industrial accidents and normal mortality rates. I filed the appropriate request for investigation, following standard protocols. The Arbites responded 3 weeks later with a brief notation. Discrepancy resolved. Administrative error corrected. They provided adjusted figures that aligned with expected trends, accepted their explanation, and returned to my normal duties. That was my first mistake. I should have questioned why Arbite's involvement was needed for a simple census correction. But I had been trained, like all Imperial citizens, to accept authority without hesitation, to trust that those above me in the vast hierarchy possessed information I lacked. The word-bearers counted on that training. Father Matthias Cord served the Cathedral of the Emperor's Eternal Light in Hive Primus's upper levels. I met him only twice during the period before the Revelation, both times during mandatory attendance at quarterly devotionals. He delivered the required liturgies with appropriate solemnity, led the congregation through the standard prayers, and conducted himself with the dignified restraint expected of a senior priest. I learned later, during the investigations that followed, about his other sermons, the ones he delivered in the underhive. The underhive population officially numbered 2 million in Hive Primus alone. Those were the citizens who maintained registration, who submitted to census verification, who appeared in official records. Below them lived an unknowable number of unregistered individuals, people born outside the administratum's knowledge, raised in the darkness beneath the functioning hive, surviving through methods the upper levels preferred to ignore. Father Corday began visiting those depths approximately 2 years before the invasion. His initial justification cited missionary work, bringing the Emperor's light to those who lived in shadow. The ecclesiarchy approved his request. Missionary initiatives among underhive populations were considered spiritually valuable, even if results rarely justified the effort. He established a chapel in District 7 Underhive, a structure assembled from salvaged materials in a space previously occupied by a defunct water reclamation facility. The chapel offered food distribution twice weekly, drawing crowds from the surrounding warrens. Father Corday preached while they ate, delivering sermons that differed from his cathedral homilies. I have read transcripts of those sermons, recovered from survivors, who maintained enough coherence to provide testimony. He spoke about suffering, about the weight of devotion to a distant emperor who demanded everything and provided little, about the injustice of imperial hierarchy, where birth determined status and effort meant nothing against the accident of genetics. He never explicitly called the emperor false. He never urged rebellion. He simply asked questions. Why did the emperor demand such sacrifice? Why did service bring only more hardship? Why did faith require suffering when the texts themselves spoke of his love for humanity? Questions are more dangerous than declarations. A declaration can be rejected, dismissed, executed. A question takes root and grows. The underhive population began attending his sermons in larger numbers. The food distribution helped, certainly, but they returned for the words, for the acknowledgement of their pain, for someone who seemed to understand their lives rather than simply demanding compliance. Father Cord never mentioned chaos. He spoke only of the emperor and what that faith required. But in his careful words, in his sympathetic tone, he was opening doors. He was teaching them that their doubt was justified, that their suffering mattered, that perhaps the system itself was flawed. By the time anyone in the upper hive noticed the chapel's popularity, 3,000 underhive residents attended regular services. The ecclesiarchy noted Father Corday's success in their quarterly reports. They commended his dedication. My second encounter with the anomaly occurred 9 months later. This time, the deviation appeared in mortality statistics. The underhive death rate had decreased by 4% across all age categories. Simultaneously, reported cases of plague and malnutrition declined to their lowest levels in recorded history. I should have filed a routine notation. Improved conditions in the underhive were desirable, after all. The administratum's stated goal included raising living standards across all imperial territories, even if practical resources rarely extended to underhive populations. But I had learned during my training that statistical anomalies often indicated larger problems. Decreased death rates without corresponding increases in medical resource allocation suggested unreported factors, possibly smuggling operations that diverted resources from proper channels, possibly organized criminal activity that had escaped Arbite's attention. I prepared a more detailed investigation request, documenting the specific nature of the anomaly and requesting cross-referencing with Medici supply chain records. I submitted the request through proper channels and expected the same cursory response I had received previously. Instead, I received a personal visit from Proctor Thaddeus Kern of the Arbites. He arrived at my office 3 days after I submitted the request. A man in his 5th decade, his face marked by the scars of decades of law enforcement work. He closed the door behind him and stood across my desk without requesting permission to sit. "Your investigation request has been noted," he said. "The matter is under Arbite's jurisdiction. You are to cease all related inquiries and remove the documentation from your active files." I had encountered Arbite's authority before. They typically explained nothing, demanded obedience, and enforced compliance through explicit threat. But Proctor Kern seemed different. He appeared tense rather than authoritative. His hand rested near his sidearm with the nervous energy of someone who expected danger in an administratum clerk's office. "May I ask the nature of the Arbite's interest in underhive health statistics?" I kept my tone respectful, my posture compliant. "No," he replied. "You may not." He left without further explanation. I removed the documentation as ordered and attempted to return to my normal duties. But the encounter stayed with me. The way his eyes had moved constantly, scanning my office as if searching for hidden threats. The tension in his shoulders that suggested fear rather than routine enforcement. The fact that an Arbite's proctor had personally delivered a message that could have been transmitted through standard channels. Something in the underhive had drawn Arbite's attention. Something serious enough to warrant secrecy. Something that terrified a man trained to face the worst humanity could produce. I should have forgotten about it. I should have focused on my assigned duties and trusted that appropriate authorities would handle whatever situation existed. But I had been trained in pattern recognition. The administratum teaches its clerks to see connections, to identify deviations, to notice when reality diverges from expected norms. Those skills were useful for census work. They were also impossible to simply turn off when ordered. So I began watching for other patterns. Not officially, not through formal investigation requests, just observing the numbers that crossed my desk naturally during my assigned work. Ecclesiarch Severina Dane presided over the Cathedral of the Emperor's Eternal Light with the stern efficiency expected of someone who had risen through the ecclesiarchy's ranks through merit rather than birth. She had served on Eureka Prime for 11 years, managing a staff of 37 priests and over 200 support personnel. Her sermons emphasized duty, sacrifice, and the absolute necessity of faith in maintaining imperial order. I attended the cathedral twice monthly, fulfilling my mandatory devotional requirements. I listened to her sermons without particular attention, recited the required prayers, and left when services concluded. My relationship with faith was bureaucratic rather than passionate. I believed because belief was required, practiced devotion because the administratum mandated it, and never questioned the underlying premises because questioning served no practical purpose. Ecclesiarch Dane began expressing concerns about Father Corde's underhive ministry during a senior staff meeting approximately 7 months after the Arbites had ordered me to cease my investigation. I learned this through administratum liaison reports that documented cathedral operations. The ecclesiarch worried that Father Cord spent excessive time in the lower levels, neglecting his duties in the main cathedral. She questioned whether his missionary work produced results commensurate with the resources allocated. Father Cord defended his ministry during multiple meetings. He presented attendance records showing growing participation in underhive services. He documented converts who had accepted formal imperial faith, receiving sanctioned prayer books, and registering with ecclesiarchy authorities. He demonstrated quantifiable success according to metrics the ecclesiarchy itself had established. The ecclesiarch reluctantly accepted his explanations. The numbers supported his work. The underhive population was receiving spiritual guidance that might prevent the usual descent into criminal activity or heretical practices. Father Cord's mission aligned with official ecclesiarchy goals. What the ecclesiarch didn't know was that Father Cord had begun introducing new elements into his sermons. Small additions, subtle shifts in emphasis. He spoke about the emperor's divinity in ways that diverged from standard liturgy. He referenced ancient texts not included in the approved canon. He described the emperor's love as transformative rather than demanding, as a force that changed believers rather than simply commanding their obedience. The underhive converts didn't recognize these deviations as heretical. They lacked the theological education to identify which elements of Father Cord's teaching matched standard doctrine and which represented dangerous innovation. They simply absorbed his words, grateful for spiritual leadership that acknowledged their existence. I discovered the theological drift by accident while processing burial records. Imperial citizens receive last rites before interment, prayers spoken by ecclesiarchy representatives that ensure the deceased's soul receives proper spiritual care. The words follow standardized formulas, unchanged for millennia. Several burial records from District 7 Underhive included prayer transcripts that deviated from the standard formulas. Minor changes. A phrase altered here, an invocation modified there. Nothing dramatic enough to immediately trigger heresy alarms. Just enough to indicate that whoever had conducted the ceremonies wasn't following approved liturgy. I compared multiple records and found the same pattern repeated. Father Cord had been conducting burials in the underhive using his own modified rites. He was teaching the converts to pray differently, to conceptualize their relationship with the emperor through frameworks that diverged from 10,000 years of established tradition. I didn't report this finding. The Arbites had already warned me away from underhive investigations. I had no desire to draw their attention again. But I kept the records in my personal files, a growing collection of anomalies that suggested something wrong was developing beneath the hive's functional surface. The first public manifestation occurred during a routine food distribution at Father Cord's chapel. 200 underhive residents had gathered for their weekly rations. Father Cord led them in prayer before the distribution began, using his modified liturgy that the congregation had learned to recite from memory. According to witnesses, the lights in the chapel brightened during the prayer. Not the normal flicker of unstable power systems, but a steady intensification that filled the space with golden illumination. The temperature increased, driving back the perpetual cold of the underhive. Several attendees reported feeling euphoria, a sense of presence that seemed to validate their faith. Then the food multiplied. The ecclesiarchy had provided rations sufficient for 200 people. When Father Cord and his assistants began distribution, they found the containers refilling as fast as they emptied. Enough food materialized to feed every person present twice over, with surplus remaining afterward. Word spread through the underhive within hours. By the next day's service, over 500 people crowded into and around the chapel. Father Cord preached about faith's power, about the emperor's love manifesting for those who truly believed. He led them in prayer using his modified liturgy, and the light returned. The warmth returned. The sense of divine presence intensified. The ecclesiarch learned of the miracle 3 days later through official channels. Father Cord had filed the required documentation, reporting a potential act of divine intervention that demanded investigation and verification. The ecclesiarch responded by dispatching a senior inquisitor to assess the situation and determine whether actual divine activity had occurred or whether the incident represented mass delusion or fraud. Inquisitor Marcellus Vrain arrived at the chapel 2 weeks after the initial miracle. He brought technical equipment designed to detect psychic phenomena, blessed sensors that measured reality fluctuations, and theological expertise that allowed him to differentiate between genuine divine intervention and chaos corruption. Father Cord welcomed the Inquisitor and invited him to attend the next service. Approximately 800 underhive residents packed the chapel and surrounding area. Father Corday led them through his modified prayers, and the phenomenon repeated. Light intensified, warmth spread, food multiplied. Several attendees fell into ecstatic states, speaking in glossolalia that the Inquisitor carefully recorded. Inquisitor Vrain's equipment detected anomalies. Reality warped subtly during the prayer, energies manifesting from what his instruments identified as Imperial sources. The warp itself was responding to the congregation's faith, manifesting effects that mimicked divine miracles. But the readings weren't conclusive enough to prove corruption. The warp responded to all psychic phenomena, including sanctioned psychers and holy relics. The Emperor himself was a warp entity of incomprehensible power. Divine intervention would necessarily involve warp energies. The Inquisitor spent 3 weeks investigating. He interviewed Father Corday extensively, examining his theological education and spiritual development. He tested the food that had multiplied, finding no corruption or taint. He observed multiple services, documenting the phenomena carefully. His final report concluded that Father Corday's ministry represented genuine faith producing genuine results. The modifications to standard liturgy were minor and theologically defensible. The underhive population had responded to spiritual leadership with authentic devotion, and that devotion had manifested measurable effects. The Emperor, through mechanisms beyond mortal understanding, had blessed this ministry. The ecclesiarchy accepted the Inquisitor's findings. Father Corday received commendation for his successful missionary work. The ecclesiarch granted him additional resources to expand the chapel and accommodate the growing congregation. What Inquisitor Vrain's instruments couldn't detect was the precise nature of the warp energies involved, the source of the power flowing through Father Corday's modified prayers, the entities that heard those prayers and responded with deliberate manipulation designed to feel like divine blessing. The Chaos Gods are patient. They understand that corruption works best when the corrupted believe themselves pure. Father Cord's success inspired other missionaries. Within 3 months, 5 additional priests had established underhive chapels across Hive Primus. Each followed Father Corday's example, offering food distribution and spiritual guidance to populations that official channels had neglected. Each adopted variations of his modified liturgy, approved by the ecclesiarch, who saw no reason to question techniques that produced documented results. The underhive population began organizing around these chapels. Attendance replaced gang affiliation as the primary social structure in multiple districts. Converts identified themselves through prayer beads fashioned from scavenged materials, through specific phrases from Father Corday's teachings, through shared participation in services where miracles manifested regularly. The crime rate in affected districts decreased measurably. The Arbites documented fewer violent incidents, less theft, reduced gang warfare. Citizens who previously survived through predation and violence now found community and purpose through faith. The transformation appeared genuinely positive from every official metric. I watched the numbers change across my census reports. Birth registrations in underhive districts increased as formerly unregistered populations began participating in official systems. Mortality rates continued their decline. Productivity measurements showed improvement as converts brought their newfound discipline to whatever labor they performed. The pattern should have been encouraging. Instead, it deepened my unease. Populations didn't transform this quickly through normal means. Religious conversion typically produced chaotic social upheaval, not orderly improvement. Something about the neatness of the changes suggested orchestration rather than organic development. I began investigating Father Cord's background through administratum archives. His service record showed standard progression through ecclesiarchy ranks, education at the Schola Progenium on a neighboring system, assignment to various parishes across the sector, transfer to Eurida Prime 11 years earlier. Nothing unusual appeared in his documented history. But I noticed gaps, periods of several months where no records existed. Standard notation indicated these represented personal retreats, time spent in contemplative isolation, as many priests practiced. The ecclesiarchy considered such retreats spiritually valuable. They didn't require detailed documentation. I cross-referenced the timing of these retreats with broader sector events. Father Cord's first documented retreat occurred immediately after a chaos incursion in the neighboring Tertius system. His second coincided with an inquisitorial investigation of cult activity on a nearby hive world. His third followed the destruction of an entire subsector by forces identified as Word-Bearers Legion. The correlation might have been coincidence. The sector had experienced numerous conflicts over the decades. Timing overlaps were inevitable. But pattern recognition was my profession, and the pattern suggested that Father Cord had been present in systems experiencing chaos activity immediately before arriving on Eurida Prime. That he had spent time in locations where the Word-Bearers operated, where corruption had spread, where faith had been weaponized against the faithful. I prepared documentation of my findings, intending to submit it through channels that would reach the Inquisition directly. The Arbites had proven unwilling to investigate, but the Inquisition had authority that superseded all local institutions. Before I could submit the report, Proctor Kern visited my office again. "You were ordered to cease investigations," he said without preamble. "You have disregarded that order." I had taken precautions. My documentation existed only in physical form, kept in my personal quarters rather than administratum systems. I had discussed my findings with no one. There was no reasonable way Proctor Kern could have known about my continued research, unless he had been watching me specifically, unless the Arbites had dedicated resources to monitoring a census clerk who had noticed statistical anomalies. "I have performed only my assigned duties," I replied. "Census verification and tithe documentation. Your assigned duties do not include investigating ecclesiarchy personnel or accessing cross-sector historical records." He moved closer to my desk. His hand rested on his sidearm with the same nervous energy I had observed during our first encounter. But this time, I recognized the source of his fear. He wasn't afraid of what I might discover. He was afraid of the orders he had been given regarding me. "The matter you are investigating is classified at levels far above your clearance," he continued. "Continued interference will result in actions neither of us desire. Cease immediately. Destroy whatever documentation you have compiled. Speak of this to no one." He left before I could respond. I sat motionless for several minutes, processing the implications of his warning. The Arbites knew about Father Cord. They had known since the beginning, since before I noticed the first statistical anomalies. They were aware of his activities, his modified liturgy, his growing influence over the underhive population, and they had been ordered not to interfere, to actively suppress investigations and silence anyone who noticed the pattern. Someone with authority exceeding the Arbites had declared Father Corday's activities permissible. Someone wanted his ministry to continue, his influence to spread, his modified prayers to reach as many citizens as possible. I should have destroyed my documentation. I should have forgotten everything I had learned and returned to my bureaucratic routine. I should have trusted that authorities wiser than myself understood factors beyond my comprehension. But I had been trained to recognize patterns, and this pattern had led to conclusions too terrible to ignore. Ecclesiarch Dane invited Father Cord to deliver a sermon in the main cathedral 6 months after the first miracle. The gesture represented significant recognition. The cathedral hosted thousands of upper hive citizens during services. Only the most theologically sound and rhetorically skilled priests received invitations to address that congregation. I attended that service. My mandatory devotional schedule placed me in the cathedral on the designated day. I found a seat in the middle sections, surrounded by mid-level administratum functionaries like myself, and waited for the service to begin. Father Corday took the pulpit with appropriate humility. He wore the robes of his station, displaying none of the ostentatious decorations some priests favored. His appearance suggested dedication rather than ambition. His voice, when he began speaking, carried the same sympathetic warmth I had heard in recordings of his underhive sermons. He spoke about faith's transformative power, about the Emperor's love reaching even the lowest citizens, about divine grace manifesting when belief became pure and untainted by doubt. His words followed orthodox theology closely enough that no obvious heresy emerged. But the subtle modifications were present, the same adjustments to liturgy that had characterized his underhive ministry, now introduced to the cathedral's educated congregation. The upper hive citizens responded differently than underhive converts. They had received proper theological education. They knew standard liturgy intimately. They should have recognized the deviations immediately. But Father Cord framed his modifications as ancient wisdom rediscovered through devoted study. He cited texts that existed in cathedral archives but were rarely referenced. He presented his teaching as a return to older, purer forms of worship that had been diluted over millennia of bureaucratic standardization. The congregation listened with increasing attention. Several citizens approached Father Corday after the service, requesting private spiritual guidance. They praised his sermon's depth, thanking him for revitalizing faith that had become routine rather than passionate. Ecclesiarch Dane observed the response with visible satisfaction. Her missionary program had succeeded beyond expectations. Father Cord's methods proved effective with both underhive and upper hive populations. She began planning to expand his techniques across the entire planet. I left the cathedral with cold certainty settling in my chest. The corruption wasn't limited to the underhive anymore. It was spreading upward through official channels, blessed by the ecclesiarchy itself, reaching citizens whose education should have made them resistant to theological manipulation. And no one in authority appeared willing or able to stop it. The nightmares started 3 weeks after Father Corday's cathedral sermon. Not just for me. Thousands of citizens across Hive Primus began reporting disturbed sleep. Medical facilities documented increased complaints of insomnia, night terrors, and sleeping difficulties. The administratum noted the trend, but attributed it to stress from increased work quotas and normal urban pressures. My own dreams followed consistent patterns. I stood in vast, empty spaces, filled with whispers I couldn't understand. Symbols appeared in the darkness, geometric patterns that hurt to observe but compelled attention. Voices spoke promises in languages I didn't recognize, offering knowledge and power if I would simply listen, simply accept, simply believe. I woke each morning exhausted, my sheets soaked with sweat, my mind filled with fragments of the dreams that faded when I tried to examine them clearly. But certain images persisted. An 8-pointed star, a book bound in skin, words written in fire that burned without consuming. I began documenting dream reports from medical facilities, cross-referencing them with chapel attendance records. The correlation was absolute. Citizens who had attended Father Cord's services, either in the underhive or the cathedral, reported dreams with consistent symbolic elements. The nightmares spread through the population along the same paths his ministry traveled. Other effects manifested. Citizens began experiencing spontaneous visions during waking hours. Brief flashes of insight, moments of clarity that seemed to reveal hidden truths about the universe. Workers reported understanding previously confusing concepts intuitively. Criminals experienced sudden guilt for past actions, seeking ecclesiarchy guidance for redemption. Ordinary citizens found themselves overwhelmed by religious ecstasy during daily prayers. The ecclesiarchy interpreted these phenomena as spiritual awakening. The planet was experiencing genuine divine intervention, they declared. The Emperor himself had turned his attention to Eurida Prime, blessing the faithful with direct communion. But I read the reports differently. The symptoms matched descriptions of warp exposure in inquisitorial manuals that had crossed my desk during tithe verification work. The visions, the nightmares, the spontaneous emotional states, all indicated psychic phenomena affecting a population that lacked proper training to resist mental intrusion. The warp was bleeding through. Reality itself was thinning. And Father Corde's prayers were opening the doors. Proctor Kern died 3 months after his second warning to me. The official report stated he had been killed during a routine enforcement action in the underhive, caught in crossfire between rival gangs. His body was recovered and given appropriate burial with full Arbeits honors. I learned the truth through connections I had developed with lower-level Arbeits personnel, who sometimes consulted with the administratum on jurisdictional matters. Proctor Kern had been investigating cult activity in District 7 Underhive independently, operating outside official channels. He had collected evidence of ritual activity connected to Father Corde's chapel. Symbols carved into walls that matched no approved Imperial iconography. Altars assembled in abandoned spaces where converts gathered for unauthorized worship. He had been preparing a report for direct transmission to the Inquisition when he disappeared. His body was found 3 days later, displaying injuries inconsistent with gang weaponry. The wounds suggested combat against superhuman opponents, against Astartes. The Arbeits suppressed these details, maintaining the official story of gang violence. But the personnel who handled the body knew what they had seen, and they were terrified. Other Arbeits investigators began disappearing, always during operations in underhive districts where Father Corde's ministry operated. Always without witnesses. Their bodies, when recovered, showed the same impossible wounds. Combat damage that suggested opponents who moved faster and struck harder than any normal human could manage. The Arbeits' command structure issued new protocols. Enforcement personnel were ordered to avoid direct confrontation with converts unless absolutely necessary. Investigation of chapel activities was declared outside Arbeits' jurisdiction. Officers who had been monitoring Father Cord's ministry were reassigned to other duties. The Arbeits, the institution charged with maintaining law across the Imperium, had effectively surrendered. They knew corruption had infected Eurida Prime. They recognized that something far beyond normal criminal activity was destroying the planet from within, but they lacked the resources and authority to combat enemies who had already neutralized their investigations. I received no more warnings from Proctor Kern's successors. They had given up trying to silence my research because silence no longer mattered. The corruption had spread beyond the point where individual knowledge posed any threat to its progress. Father Cord announced a planet-wide pilgrimage 8 months after his cathedral sermon. Faithful citizens from all hive cities would journey to a site in the equatorial wastes, a location where ancient texts suggested the Emperor himself had once walked during the Great Crusade. The pilgrimage would last 3 days, concluding with a mass ceremony where thousands of believers would pray together for divine guidance. The ecclesiarchy endorsed the pilgrimage enthusiastically. Ecclesiarch Dane declared it an opportunity for spiritual renewal across the entire planet. She encouraged all citizens who could be spared from essential duties to participate. The administratum granted special dispensations, allowing workers to take leave for the journey. 30,000 citizens departed Hive Primus. Similar numbers traveled from the other major settlements. They walked rather than taking transport, following Father Cord's teaching that the journey itself was a form of devotion. They carried supplies sufficient for 3 days. They sang modified hymns as they traveled, filling the waste with sound. I did not join the pilgrimage. My census duties qualified as essential work, providing legitimate excuse to remain in the hive. But I watched the departure with a sick certainty that those citizens were walking willingly toward their own destruction. The pilgrimage site Father Cord had selected was ancient. Archaeological surveys documented pre-Imperial structures beneath the sand, ruins from humanity's first colonization efforts 10,000 years earlier. The site held no official religious significance. No records indicated the Emperor had ever visited this particular location. But the site sat directly above a geological fault line where the planet's crust was thinnest, where the barrier between reality and the warp was most fragile, where ritual conducted by trained personnel could tear that barrier open. I submitted one final report to the Inquisition. I documented everything I had discovered over the preceding months. Father Cord's modified liturgy, the underhive conversions, the spreading nightmares, the Arbite's casualties, the pilgrimage to a geologically significant site. I transmitted the report through every available channel, hoping at least one would reach authorities who could respond. Then I waited. The pilgrimage lasted 3 days as promised. The pilgrims reached the site, established camps, and participated in continuous prayer services led by Father Corda and the other missionary priests. Vox reports transmitted back to the hives described overwhelming spiritual experiences. Visions of the Emperor himself speaking directly to the faithful. Sensations of divine presence so intense they transcended description. On the 3rd day, Father Cord led the final ceremony. 30,000 voices joined in modified prayer, reciting liturgy that diverged further from standard forms with each verse. The words resonated with power that transcended mere sound. Reality bent around their faith. And something answered. The warp tore open above the pilgrimage site. Not the controlled breach that navigator-guided ships used for faster-than-light travel. An uncontrolled rupture that vomited raw chaos into reality. Demons manifested, creatures of impossible geometry and malevolent sentience. They descended upon the pilgrims in a tide of corruption that should have slaughtered the faithful instantly. But the pilgrims didn't die. They welcomed the demons. They embraced corruption with the same fervent faith they had directed toward the Emperor. Because Father Cord had spent months teaching them that divine intervention felt overwhelming, that true faith required surrendering doubt. that transformation through devotion meant accepting whatever power answered their prayers. They couldn't distinguish between the Emperor's grace and demonic corruption. Father Corday had deliberately removed their ability to recognize the difference. He had trained them to believe that overwhelming psychic phenomena indicated divine presence, that visions and transformations proved authenticity, that faith required accepting whatever manifested in response to prayer. The pilgrims transformed. Their bodies warped as chaos flooded through them. Some became hosts for lesser demons. Others mutated into forms better suited to serving the dark gods. A few achieved something resembling apotheosis, becoming living conduits for warp energy that would have destroyed normal humans instantly. Father Corday stood at the center of the transformation, his own body shifting as he dropped the disguise he had maintained for years. He wasn't human, had never been human. He was Astartes of the Word-Bearers Legion, his enhanced physiology concealed beneath carefully maintained psychic illusion. His mission had been exactly what I feared: infiltrate, corrupt, convert, and then reveal the truth when the population was too compromised to resist. The transformed pilgrims returned to the hives. They brought corruption with them, spreading it through communities where their prayers had already weakened reality's fabric. Chaos manifested openly now, no longer requiring careful orchestration. The planet's faith had been turned into a weapon pointed directly at itself. The Planetary Defense Force mobilized when reports from the pilgrimage site reached military command. They deployed armor and infantry to contain what they initially interpreted as a demonic incursion requiring standard defensive response. They expected to fight external enemies manifesting from the warp. They expected the usual battle between Imperial forces and chaos corruption. They didn't expect to fight their own civilians, fathers and mothers, and children who had departed as faithful Imperial citizens and returned as willing servants of the dark gods. People who still believed themselves loyal, who still prayed to the Emperor, but whose prayers now fed entities that answered through them. The PDF hesitated. Their training covered combat against heretics and cultists who openly embraced chaos. Their protocols addressed enemies who declared their corruption, who attacked with obvious malevolence. They had no procedures for handling citizens who insisted on their loyalty, even as their bodies manifested demonic mutations. That hesitation was fatal. The transformed pilgrims walked directly into defensive positions, praying loudly, offering blessings in the Emperor's name. PDF soldiers held fire, uncertain whether their targeting data was accurate, whether the mutations they observed were real or some form of psychic deception. By the time Command authorized engagement, the corrupted had closed to melee range. Citizens whose bodies had been enhanced by warp energies tore through PDF ranks with inhuman strength. Demons manifested in the confusion, using the corrupted as anchors to pull themselves into reality. The defensive line collapsed within hours. Similar scenarios played out across all major settlements. The ecclesiarchy compounded the disaster by initially defending the pilgrims, insisting they represented divine transformation rather than corruption. Ecclesiarch Dane herself declared the mutations to be holy stigmata, evidence of the Emperor's direct intervention in their flesh. By the time she recognized the truth, chaos forces controlled half of Hive Primus. Churches became summoning grounds. Cathedrals transformed into fortresses, where the corrupted gathered to conduct rituals that widened the warp tears. The faith that had held Eurida Prime together for thousands of years became the infrastructure for its destruction. I witnessed the fall of the Administratum complex, where I had worked for 15 years. Corrupted citizens walked through the main entrance unopposed, because security protocols didn't recognize them as threats. They were registered citizens with proper identification. Their biometric data matched records. The complex's defenses, designed to stop external invasion, never activated against advanced enemies who had been granted access as loyal workers. They moved through the corridors, calling others to join them in prayer. Some administratum personnel complied, participating in rituals that had been normalized over months of gradual theological drift. Those who resisted were killed. Those who fled carried corruption with them, spreading nightmares and visions wherever they sought refuge. I escaped through maintenance tunnels that connected the complex to the hive's infrastructure. I had studied those passages while researching underhive statistics. I had memorized routes that would allow movement through the hive without using monitored thoroughfares. That knowledge saved my life, but it couldn't save the planet. The Word-Bearer's fleet translated into real space 3 days after the pilgrimage site incident. 20 vessels of various sizes, displaying heraldry that hadn't been seen openly in the sector for centuries. They didn't attack immediately. They simply established orbit and began broadcasting across all frequencies. Father Cord's voice, but amplified through Astarte's physiology, no longer constrained by the pretense of human limitation. He spoke to the planet he had spent years corrupting. Faithful of Eureka Prime, you have been deceived. The Emperor you worship is a corpse god, sustained by sacrificing thousands of psychers daily. His Imperium grinds humanity beneath bureaucratic tyranny, sacrificing trillions for the comfort of the privileged few. We have shown you truth. We have demonstrated that powers exist who answer prayers with genuine transformation rather than empty promises. You have felt their touch. You have experienced their gifts. Now choose. Continue serving a dead god. Brace the entities who have already proven their reality through action. It was propaganda. Chaos corruption dressed in the rhetoric of liberation. Any loyal citizen should have recognized it as heresy, requiring immediate rejection. But Father Cord had spent years teaching the population to question their faith's foundations, to ask why devotion required suffering, to wonder whether the Imperium's demands were truly justified. He had planted doubts carefully, nurtured questions patiently, until the population's resistance to heretical arguments had been systematically dismantled. When he offered an alternative, millions of citizens were psychologically prepared to consider it. They had been primed to believe that overwhelming psychic phenomena indicated divine presence. That transformation proved authenticity. That faith required accepting whatever answered their prayers. The Word-Bearers didn't need to conquer Eureka Prime. They simply needed to offer validation for beliefs Father Cord had already instilled. To confirm that yes, the powers the faithful had experienced were real. Yes, devotion to those powers was justified. Yes, transformation was the natural result of true faith. The planet surrendered, not through military defeat, but through mass conversion. Billions of citizens who had begun the year as loyal Imperial subjects ended it as willing chaos worshippers. They didn't see themselves as traitors. They believed they had discovered deeper truth, that they had evolved beyond the Imperium's crude theology into more sophisticated understanding. Father Cord had taught them that faith was transformation. The Word-Bearers simply directed that transformation toward the gods, who had been waiting patiently for the invitation. The Imperium's response arrived 2 months after the planet's fall. A battle fleet commanded by the Ultramarines chapter, accompanied by inquisitorial forces and sufficient guard regiments to reclaim a world. They found a population that still displayed Imperial symbols, still sang hymns that mentioned the Emperor, still maintained the superficial appearance of loyalty. But the prayers went to different entities now. The rituals had been modified beyond recognition. The citizens welcomed the fleet with religious fervor, treating the arriving forces as guests to be converted rather than liberators to be welcomed. The fleet commander declared exterminatus. The planet was too corrupted to be purged through conventional means. The population was too thoroughly compromised to be rehabilitated. Eureka Prime would burn, reduced to lifeless rock that would serve as a warning to other worlds about the price of theological deviation. I escaped on one of the last refugee vessels that left before the orbital bombardment began. The Inquisition detained all refugees for extensive interrogation and psychological screening. Most were executed as hopelessly corrupted. A few, like myself, were deemed potentially salvageable after reconditioning. I spent 6 months in an inquisitorial facility while they dismantled my memories and rebuilt my faith according to approved patterns. They removed the doubts Father Cord had planted. They reinforced orthodox theology with methods that made reconditioning seem gentle. They ensured I would never again question the structures that kept humanity functioning across a hostile galaxy. But they couldn't erase the understanding that had developed through my research. The recognition of how the word-bearers operate. How they corrupt not through obvious evil, but through careful manipulation of legitimate concerns. How they turn faith into a weapon by teaching believers to trust feelings over doctrine, to privilege personal spiritual experiences over institutional guidance. The Imperium survives through rigidity because flexibility means vulnerability. Because the moment citizens begin questioning why they believe, begin evaluating whether their faith's demands are justified, they open themselves to arguments that can't be answered through doctrine alone. The word-bearers understand this. They know that faith without doubt is unassailable, but faith that questions itself can be redirected toward entities who answer those questions with transformative power rather than institutional authority. 7 billion citizens died when Eureka Prime burned. The planet's infrastructure, built over thousands of years, was reduced to molten slag. The archives that contained our culture and history were obliterated. The cathedrals where generations had worshipped became radioactive craters. We lost more than a planet. We lost the comfortable certainty that faith protects. The word-bearers demonstrated that the Imperium's greatest strength, the absolute devotion of its citizens to the Emperor, could be turned into catastrophic vulnerability if manipulated correctly. That belief itself was a door that opened from inside when the right words were whispered through the cracks. The Inquisition classified all records of how Eureka Prime fell. They didn't want other worlds learning the specific techniques Father Corday had employed. They worried that publicizing the methods would simply provide a template for other chaos forces to replicate. Better that Eureka Prime be remembered only as a world that fell to corruption, with the details buried in sealed archives. But I remember. The survivors remember. We carry the knowledge of how a loyal Imperial world was convinced to destroy itself, how faith was weaponized, how millions died, not because they were conquered, but because they were converted. The word-bearers didn't need to fire a shot. They simply needed one patient infiltrator, several years, and the understanding that faith, when carefully manipulated, can become the most effective weapon ever deployed against the faithful. I serve the Administratum on a different world now. I process different census data, verify different tithe records, fulfill the same bureaucratic functions I performed on Eureka Prime. My faith has been rebuilt according to approved patterns. I recite standard prayers without deviation. I attend mandatory devotionals and maintain compliance with all ecclesiarchy requirements. But I watch for patterns. I notice statistical anomalies. I observe when reality diverges from expected norms. Because the word-bearers are patient and methodical. Because Father Cord wasn't unique, but representative of a strategy the 17th Legion has perfected over 10,000 years. Because somewhere in the Imperium's vast territories, another infiltrator is beginning another long game of conversion and corruption. The Imperium teaches that faith protects. That devotion to the Emperor shields humanity from chaos corruption. That proper belief serves as armor against the warp's influence. But the word-bearers understand what the Imperium refuses to acknowledge. Faith is not armor. Faith is a door, and it opens from the inside. Every prayer is an invitation. Every moment of devotion creates a connection between the believer and the entities they address. The Emperor, distant and dying on his golden throne, may not hear individual prayers. But other powers listen constantly, waiting for the faithful to call out with sincerity that transcends doctrine. The question that haunts my reconstructed faith is simple. How do you distinguish between divine grace and demonic manipulation when both manifest as overwhelming psychic power? How do you know whether your prayers reach the Emperor or something else that wears his name as a mask? The Imperium's answer is to obey without question, to trust institutional authority over personal experience, to maintain rigid adherence to approved doctrine regardless of what your faith tells you. Perhaps that rigidity is necessary. Perhaps the vulnerability created by questioning faith is too dangerous to permit in a universe where chaos waits for every opening. Or perhaps the Imperium's solution simply creates different vulnerabilities, different doors that open when different words are whispered, different ways for the word-bearers to break a world before they burn it. I don't have answers. I have only the memory of 7 billion dead, and the certainty that somewhere, right now, it's happening again.